これより個人や地域、ネットワークから生まれる教育イノベーションを開催いたします。それでは本プログラムのモデレーターをランバイクリエーション代表理事、そしてMost Likely to Succeedを日本に紹介し、現在はアンバサダーを務めております竹村恵美が担当させていただきます。恵美さん、よろしくお願いします。
はい、皆さんおはようございます。Thank you so much for coming in this morning. I'm sure it's very cold in Japan and perhaps very warm in Hawaii, but today we have a distinguished guest from East Coast of the US and West Coast of the US and also Hawaii, and us from Tokyo and Nagano and elsewhere in Japan. So it's a pretty exciting kind of worldwide global panel discussion we're having this morning. And as many of you might know, that Learn by Creation Nagano, we started 3 weeks ago. And the first week, we focused on great local practice of innovative education in Nagano. And then the week 2, we focused on what happens when people work together across like traditional boundaries. And then the week 3, we are focusing on what can we create going forward. So I'm really excited to welcome 3 speakers today to discuss what kind of bottom-up innovation we could co-create to sort of help spur the innovation in our education system. So, hi, good morning, good afternoon, Ted and Josh and Sunanna. Hi.
Hello.
It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. Ted, are you joining in from East Coast of the US today?
I am. I'm in Virginia.
Oh, okay. You're from Virginia. And Sunanna, how about you?
I am usually in Oakland, California, but have been spent almost the last 6 months in Massachusetts. So,
oh, wow. Oh, okay.
So also east side of the US.
Oh, okay. So it's 8:30 p.m. In your time.
Right.
Okay, great.
Right.
And then Josh?
Yeah, coming to you from Honolulu, Hawaii.
I think we're all envious of where you are.
It's bright and sunny and about 85 degrees. So.
Awesome. Okay, so today we would kind of like to focus on self introduction of the speakers first, and then we'll move on to panel discussion followed by Q&A. So definitely for everyone, we'll have plenty of time to hopefully answer your questions. And so first, let's start with you, Ted. A lot of people in Nagano, I'm sure, know about the film Most Likely to Succeed, and I'm sure many of the attendees today, we already have 100 people joining our conversation this morning, but I think many people don't know how you got involved in creating a film. How's your interest in education really get started? Sort of going above and beyond and making a film and a website and helping out other education companies and organizations around the world.
Sure. Well, I spent most of my professional career in a field called venture capital. So I was with a firm, we would invest money in brand new companies, companies that were 1, 2, or 3 people big. We did, don't blame me, it wasn't my deal. We were the first round investors in Twitter. So that's the type of thing. So 2 people approach us for money, we back them. And so having done that for 25 years, I had a pretty good sense of the dynamic of innovation and how it's changing our world. And then honestly, when I started to pay attention to what was happening with my kids, I started to say, wait a minute, I sort of went from trusting education to questioning education to being alarmed about education. And I felt like it wasn't just that it wasn't helping prepare them for the world I knew they'd be heading into. I actually felt it was impairing their chances and their prospects. That's an alarming thing when you think, when you say to the school your kids are in, as long as you're just useless, I'm fine. But if you start to do real damage, I'm going to be, coming to talk to you about it. But I realize that's a big issue, right? It's not just a kid here and a kid there. It's millions and millions of kids who are being educated in a way that essentially accentuates the rote skills and crushes out the creativity and the curiosity and the audacity. So the very things that machine intelligence does perfectly is the metric of success in school, and the very things that will help an adult do really well in a world defined by innovation are what we're crushing out of kids. So it's just like it's upside down. It's all backwards. And so when I thought about a strategy or approach, this was all kind of coming into focus for me about 10 years ago. I thought the best place to start was with a film. And the reason for that was if we could manage to create a great film, it's something people can see again and again everywhere. And also it can reach people emotionally. Books reach people logically. I've written books. Talks, I hope we reach people a bit emotionally, but it's largely a logical approach. But a film, and I think people who seem most likely to succeed often are quite moved by it, because you see this journey of these students and you see the passion of the teachers, and you see we got a surprise ending with it that really, I still tear up. I've seen the end of that film 250 times. I still tear up when I see it. And so, I did that. I set out on that path. It was really, the idea was kind of looking ahead to the world our kids would be adults in. If you worked back from that kind of world, what kind of school experience would prepare them? So I did a search. I found a great director, and Greg Whiteley is remarkable. And we decided to work together on this film. And then we sent him to 12 schools trying to find the right set of circumstances. And he did a lot of filming we just threw out, honestly. We have 900 hours of film that turned into 90 minutes. That's the kind of ratio you have. But we found that he happened to be at this school in San Diego, High Tech High, on the first day of class, happened to catch two kids at the beginning who went on to have great personal journeys and fell in love with what he was filming. And so we went through that process. It was 2 years of full-time filming for a team of 4. So this was not a modest effort. And what our goal was to produce an artistically great film. And I think we did. I mean, it was Sundance, Tribeca, AFI. I mean, it was 30 major film festivals. And then I turned down Netflix after that and said, let's do school community screening so people could come together and watch it as a group and have a discussion about the future of their school, the future of their kids. And so that's what we set out to do. We've done now, I would say 10,000 school community screenings, 35 different countries. And it really has accomplished everything I had hoped for. I mean, there are a lot of things I do with my life that fall quite short, but that one I think actually worked the way we had hoped, which was powerful film, give you a vision of a different type of school experience, not say this is what you have to do or this is better, but to say, observe, think about it, and just ask yourself, what kind of school would I want my child in? What kind of school would I want to teach in? What kind of school would I want to be in if I were a student? And then hope that would sort of begin to generate and catalyze change. And we can get in later about what we've done since then, but that's how it all got started. And in the film is timeless. I think people watch it and watch it and watch it. And then one of the great things is when you do that, then you start to meet these great people along the way, like Josh and Sunanna and Emmy. So I have all these really great friends, and I get to spend Saturday night with people I really love. So it's terrific.
Yeah, I mean, you really hit the nail in terms of moving people's heart through the film, and that's exactly what's happening in Japanese education communities as well. Nagano, especially, I believe outside of Tokyo, has the most number of film screenings and conversation. And that types of conversation has literally led to a conference that we're having today. So it's quite amazing that the emotional journey of of the students at High Tech High can really transcend to us having conversation in Japan. And so that's wonderful. And I look forward to talking more about what have you been working on after.
Can I just add, though, I am honored to be part of this and to virtually meet people from Nagano. As you know, I was with you in Tokyo in June of 2018, and my wife will pull the chair out from under me if I don't say we would really love to come visit Nagano sometime as soon as we could travel again. So this is a real treat for us.
Oh, that would be wonderful. I think people love to meet you. Thank you, Ted. And we'll come back to what school could be, your work on that after that. And let's, Josh, you're here. Sorry. Yep. Hi, Josh. One of your titles is most likely what school could be Hawaii, which is a second book after Most Likely to Succeed, Ted has published. But just curious, how did you get involved with this effort? And you're sort of like glue in connecting diverse communities in Hawaii. And where is your passion in this coming from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to start by just recognizing, Emmy, what a fantastic moment it was when I discovered you in Japan. You were like my doppelganger. You were Josh, and I was like, I'm amazed. There's another person in the world who's doing what I'm doing, and so that was a very special moment, and led to, to today. So I'm born and raised in Hawaii, in Honolulu. I'm a former chef, former hotel manager, former teacher. I was a history, economics, Hawaiian studies teacher for 17 years in 3 different private schools here in Hawaii. I left teaching and became a salesperson with Apple here in Honolulu, and I'm still there. I'm 6 years into that job. And about a year into my time at Apple, some friends, educators at Punahou School, via an email, told me that there was this film called Most Likely to Succeed that I really needed to see. I watched it and was so knocked out by it that I realized in a heartbeat that it was the thing that I had been looking for a long time. Going back maybe, Emmy, 15 years, I had tried to be an agent for change in education and had failed. And it was just very difficult to make any headway. And then I discovered the film, and that was in August of 2015. And so I screened it as a community screener here in Honolulu. And then my brother attended that screening, and he suggested that I screen it with him at a community center on the windward side of Oahu. And so we started working on that screening. And I have to share with you that the reason why Ted and I connected is because I had sent a pretty cranky email to Ted's team because they had not listed my screening on their website, and I wanted to be listed. And so somehow they read that email as Josh really wants to be involved. And I think right at that moment, Ted and his team, Ted was in the middle of his year-long 50-state tour. They asked me to coordinate the final stop on that tour, on Ted's tour, which was the 50th state, which is here in Hawaii. That was May of 2016. So since then, 6 years later almost, I've screened Most Likely to Succeed more times than I can count. And I totally agree with Ted. It is a timeless film. And, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it will still be one of the most important resources for driving education innovation conversations that exists in the world. That and his book, What School Could Be, those two, and now what's coming, what has already arrived now, whatschoolcouldbe.org. But the film Most Likely to Succeed, I never tire of watching it. And I agree with Ted that I never tire of watching the last few minutes, which I won't give it away if anybody hasn't seen it, but it's very emotional. It's very special. And so it's very much a privilege on my part to be able to work with Ted and his team to do this most likely to succeed work here in Hawaii. And it's been a blast, a real blast for 6 years now. And I think we're just getting started on the next part of it.
Great. It's so true that it's a timeless piece. And in Japan, we've started a screening with Japanese subtitle in 2017, thanks to Ted's generosity in creating Japanese subtitle version. And even today, now with the COVID, there's a little bit less of a screening going on, but now people are starting to talk about, oh, maybe we can watch individually and have conversation online with a virtual screening. And so it's definitely a timeless piece, and a lot of people are just now discovering it in Japan. So that's great. Thank you. And now I'd like to welcome Sunanna.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
This is actually my first time to meet with you, Sunanna, and it's such an honor to have you on our conversation, because I've been really admiring your work at the Remake Learning, and as well as I read quite a bit about your work at a reinvention lab at on the website, and so really excited to learn more about what you do. But could you introduce yourself a little bit, and including how the film and your work at Remake Learning were collaborating together, and what is your work right now at Teach for America?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. Emmy, thank you for taking a leap of faith on someone you didn't know as well, and inviting me. And of course, Ted, friend and colleague, go back a few years now, Ted and Josh, for inviting me to participate. I really appreciate it. Very happy to be here. So my name is Sunanna Chand. I started as a first and second grade teacher. So I taught young people ages 5 through about 7 in a city called Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in the south of the United States. And since then, it's been over a decade now, I've really dedicated my life to thinking about how do we radically transform the education system, both from a lens of exactly what Ted was talking about, around how the economy is changing so rapidly, and our schools are not designed for the fifth industrial revolution that we're in, but also through a lens of racial and economic justice here in the United States. So right now I am honored to be Vice President of Systems Reinvention at Teach for America, which means we're thinking very deeply about both how do we be in support of people all over the United States, people like Ted and Josh, who have been working so diligently around radically transforming the education system in the States, and how do we also think of a radical reimagining of our organization, because we know that in order to change learning, education institutions need to change also, and that is such an important part of any of this work. And before that, I was director of something called Remake Learning in Pittsburgh, very dear to my heart. Remake Learning is a network of over 600 organizations in the Pittsburgh region that, range from schools to museums to libraries, centers of faith, out-of-school organizations, government, philanthropy, who are all coming together and thinking deeply about what the future of learning looks like, deeply embedded in the community of Pittsburgh and the greater Pittsburgh region. And so happy to talk a little bit more about how we really wove that community together so that folks were working together in pretty dynamite ways to think about what the future of learning looks like in that community. And that's where I met Ted. He came through on his 50-state tour as well, and I had the great pleasure of introducing him at a large community gathering and screening we had in Pittsburgh. We did multiple screenings in Pittsburgh of the film as well, and to this day, it is still, what I give to people as like an introductory text of when people say, why does learning need to be changed? Why does it need to be different? I mean, that is the foundational piece that I use and say, if you haven't watched this, that's step one. So very excited to be here, and thank you for having me.
Great. You just gave a great segue to our conversation, because I wanted to kind of start out our panel discussion with how the film is igniting conversation in your local communities, for example, in Hawaii or in Pittsburgh or elsewhere that you've seen. And what are some of the, like, radical, you're saying, but like amazing steps that people are taking? Because in Japan, we are starting a new education guideline as of this year. So we are, in terms of our country, the government or the Ministry of Education is proposing a radical change in our education, embrace more inquiry-based learning, not just the cognitive skill, but non-cognitive skills are important. So there's a lot of great messages coming in from our sort of government side, but of course education is a big system, and there are many layers and many stakeholders involved in making any change happen at our local public schools and local school communities. So I'd love to hear about what you have seen, or what you're involved in the US in terms of, after the film, what are the small steps that the teachers or communities are taking. Whoever like to start?
I'm actually,
Josh?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump this one. I think one of the most radical things that's happening here in Hawaii, and some of it has to do actually with the number of times that Most Likely to Succeed has been screened here. I'd like to think that maybe more than any other state, this state has screened the film, but there are many other factors involved. So the most radical thing is a really remarkable outreach that's going on between schools, nonprofits, and businesses. Mm-hmm. And they're reinventing their relationships that were very different 10, 15 years ago. I like to talk about what I call the era of the 3-ring binder. So what I mean by that is that oftentimes nonprofits would put together these programs that they thought schools should do. So, cleaning up a fish pond, or, helping with the homeless, or whatever it is. And they would come to the schools and they would present these 3-ring binders, which are always about, 8 inches thick. And they would say, you folks at the school, you should be doing these programs. And of course, they just weigh down on the schools. And of course, those 3-ring binders would end up on the shelf. I think that era is over. And I think what's happening now is that there's a very organic outreach that's going on, and inreach, I suppose, where nonprofits and businesses and schools are starting to build relationships with each other. And they're not doing it using 3-ring binders. They're doing it using personal connections, personal relationships. And I think if there's, one thing I would love to pass on to, the folks who are on this call in Nagano, it's that's a really key component to moving education forward into the 21st century. We have to collaborate. We have to work together as teams of business and nonprofit and school communities in the interests of student-driven learning. So that's something that I'm seeing here in Hawaii, and I'm really, really excited about it. It just means that there's more than educators to work with. There's all different types of people to work with here in Hawaii, and they're all remarkable, and they're all really ready to pitch in and help make education, public, private, and charter better.
That's a really important topic, how to build relationship, because oftentimes, teachers are very busy, and it's very easy for teachers to just focus on their work, or also local communities or the industry, like a nonprofit, to focus on their effort. And how are you kind of making the space or the container for that conversation or the relationship to flourish?
So actually, I think this is the perfect moment to hand it off to Sunanna, because what happened in Pittsburgh, which is something that Ted writes about in his book, What School Could Be, is a phenomenal story. And she was in the center of that. So I would hand it off to you, Sunanna, and have you talk about how that happened in Pittsburgh.
I'm happy to. And also I see, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Cho, you had a great question in the chat. So I'm also happy to talk about that and what the Reinvention Lab is doing there too. How do you create these? I mean, what Josh said is absolutely right. Some of the success of the future of learning work in Pittsburgh has been weaving between industry, education, government, philanthropy, in and out of school organizations, families. And we use something in Pittsburgh called the 5 C's as a way to do that. So the first C was communicate. Storytelling, we know the power of storytelling. Ted has shown it, Josh has shown it. In Nagano, the story of Most Likely to Succeed is a way to make the invisible visible in terms of what's necessary for change. And so we told stories, certainly the ones, you know, like Most Likely to Succeed, but also stories of individual educators, and making sure that those stories were told far and wide across the community so that people knew, even if they weren't at that school or that organization, that there was innovation happening and that they weren't alone. The second thing was coordination. People walk through many doors to get into the future of learning work. Sometimes it's through computer science. Sometimes it's through project-based learning. Sometimes it's through social emotional learning. There are lots of doors. And whatever door you come through is great. We want to make sure that the other people that are doing that thing, who are walking through that door, are with you. So we would coordinate groups around computer science. We would coordinate groups around personalized learning to make sure that people had their community, sub-community within this future of learning work. We would catalyze work. So we would give small grants with very low, if at all, strings attached to them. So that people could experiment and take risks, you know, $1,000, $2,000, $5,000, so that educators could feel like they could try something new without needing to have the burden of that financial barrier. We would convene people all the time, just like this, bringing people together almost once a week across our community in big and small ways. And then finally, we would champion the work of educators who are doing incredible things. So we had something called Remake Learning Days, where it was like a giant open house of the future of learning all across the region for the week. There were hundreds of events at schools, museums, libraries, organizations that just like hands-on celebrated the future of learning. And that was really huge in building that investment and actually seeing for yourself what the future looked like. And so you can find all of those at playbook.remakelearning.org. It comes from something called the Remake Learning Playbook. But that is like very tactically and tangibly how that network functioned.
Wow. You must have been very busy when you were
Shout out to the Remake Learning team. Certainly not just me. Lots of people who were there with me, who are still now, who are making all that work.
Right. I mean, I have watched the video and seen the website of Remake Learning and read a lot about it. In addition to, I mean, initially inspired by Ted's book. And I was just kind of really curious why Pittsburgh was so special versus there's so many other regional communities trying to, you know, do probably exactly the same things that Remake Learning. And I'm sure there are many other success examples, but it seems like you guys have really kind of nailed that coordination effort to create the 5 things that you were talking about. How did you kind of make that happen? Just curious.
I think, well, first of all, I have to shout out other communities who do have similar types of networks. Chicago Learning Exchange, there's one in Kansas City. In San Diego, where High Tech High is, there's a community of folks. So there are people who have started, sometimes they're called learning networks or learning ecosystems across the country. I think in Pittsburgh, for me, it was honestly funders that really cared about the weaving between organizations, which is really hard to measure or document because it is exactly what Josh was talking about. It's about relationships. And so it's hard to quantify what my relationship with Ted is. You know, we've been doing this work together for a long time. There's no way I can put a number on that. report it to a funder. But the impact that Ted and I's relationship has had an incredible impact, both on my work personally, but also on Pittsburgh, and now at my work at Teach for America. And so I think it's that type of investment that doesn't necessarily have a quantitative output all the time, but is incredibly necessary for this work to really thrive in a community, is one thing that, and you know, giving a lot of shout outs, but to Greg Baer in Pittsburgh, who really cares about and understands the value of that, you know, that intentional weaving of people together.
And Emmy, I would add also that in order to build relationships, you have to know who the people are that you want to build relationships with. So how do you find out about them? And you know, what Ted did as a follow-up to Most Likely and as a follow-up to his year-long tour was to write his book, What School Could Be. And that, more than anything in my life, caring about education, opened my eyes to who all these people are across the United States, and every nook and cranny of every state. I learned about people who are doing work that I was doing, and it was inspiring. And I have connected and built relationships with a number of them. And that's been very sustaining for me. It's been like fuel in my tank to have those kinds of relationships. So I think in order to start, you have to find out who's out there. And to find out who's out there, you have to look to resources where people are listed and that and are willing to be contacted. Businesses, nonprofits, other organizations, and things like that. Maybe, you know, Ted, you could talk about, you know, what your intentions were when you put the book together, and how that unfolded.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that defines my whole worldview, and I think it goes back to being in business as a venture capitalist, where as a venture capitalist, I was never in a position of telling somebody what their dreams should be. I was in a position of supporting people to achieve their dreams. And I think that's one of the things we've gotten so wrong about school is, you know, and I think this is a global observation, is that along the way, we somehow convinced ourselves that the path to success is for some group to tell everybody in schools what they have to do. Somehow it would be the biggest of all tragedies if a kid missed in 5th grade some topic that honestly they would never use as an adult. But nevertheless, let's make sure every teacher is teaching the same thing to kids the same month in the same grade. And what happens, right, is when you make people do something they're not interested in, you don't get magic, you don't get inspiration, you don't get great results. When you invite people to set goals for themselves and to explore what they want to do, they do the most amazing things. And so, you know, Sunanna and Josh are on this because they've done extraordinary things, but having spent a lot of time in both Pittsburgh and Hawaii and bunches of other places, what makes them great is that they're not just like anything else. These were intensely creative experiences. These were things that people in a community felt, this is what we can do to generate widespread enthusiasm for this vision of learning that honestly, once you see it, there's no turning back. You know, once you see it, once you feel it, you can never look at kids taking notes, memorizing for an exam and spilling back facts and say you're doing that kid, you know, long-term good from an education like that. And I think that, so, you know, when I took my trip, I really was more almost like a research immersion where I traveled for 10 and a half straight months, but I was blown away by the many different creative things. And I think this is really relevant to what's going on in Japan, what's going on in Nagano, is ultimately what we do in a school is quite local. You know, what we do in a prefecture or a district here or a state here, it's very local. You know, so we have choices we can make that affect the future of our children. We have choices we can make that support our teachers to do what they desperately want to do, which is to inspire those kids. Or we can make wrong choices. We can make choices that say everybody's got to study the same thing so they can take the same exam, so we can compare a kid in Nagano to a kid in Hiroshima to a kid in Des Moines, Iowa or something, which we somehow convinced ourselves is a sensible thing. And so one of the things that gets me very excited is when you see people who suddenly say, yes, we can do so much better. And the journey to getting there is actually incredibly fulfilling. Nobody ever describes this as work. I think it's joyful, right? It's joyful. I mean, I'll brag a little, but Josh has a full-time job and does all this as a volunteer. He gets more done, and he must be doing this 60, 70 hours a week on top of a full-time job. But I don't think Josh would ever call it work. I think he'd call it pure joy. And Sunanna, I know she's like the most passionate, committed person, but you can see the smile on her face. It's when you think about actually weighing in and supporting what's going on in schools in a way that has kids coming to school with a bounce in their step, kids with a great big smile, kids just saying, I can't wait to be in school, teachers saying, I love my profession. If we get that right, just that right, so many other great things happen. And the issue is, and the challenge is that the people who write these policies don't understand that. And I think the best thing we can do is just ignore them because they're just wrong. And I often say, too many people sending out these policy binders care a lot more about data than they do about children. Right. And I think it's time for a lot of us to start caring a lot about children.
I think one of the biggest challenges we have in Japan, maybe similar to the issues you have in the US, is the sort of traditional learning has a measurable, quantifiable data, which makes it very easy to compare across the state in terms of the test score improvement in certain prefectures versus another. And I think many people, I mean, in Japan, I think the film has been screened at least 500 times, if not more, in 45 out of 47 prefectures. So a lot of people have seen it, and a lot of people have started having this conversation. And I think one of the biggest challenges is, oh, I know this types of new, engaging learning, like project-based learning, looks great, but how do you prove this actually works for kids when there's no immediate sort of test score type of things? And I'm just curious how in the US you guys are bridging this conversation, because I'm sure that probably comes up elsewhere as well. And also, I think transforming school takes time, or transforming education is a multiple year, if not decades effort. And I think, at least in Japan, the budget is a annual budget, and a lot of people want to see result in the short term. So how do you kind of, navigate to work towards the long-term effectiveness while managing the sort of short-term pressure to explain this is working?
I think, Emmy, I would love to jump in and pick up the first question that you were asking about assessments and about how do we know that learning is happening. As 17 years in 3 private schools here in Hawaii, I did exactly, for part of the time, what private school teachers are really duty bound to do, which is to assign the work, give the kids the content, and then test them, make them write papers, have them take tests, submit those grades, help them to prepare for the SAT tests, and help them track towards college. I have a lot of regrets about the extent to which I actually, played along with that. And to come back to most likely to succeed, the moment that I saw that film and I saw the exhibition of learning that took place at High Tech High, that is the focus of the film, I wasn't unaware of that idea, but I had never seen it presented quite in that way. And this is kudos to Greg Whiteley for how he shot it and edited those sequences of the public exhibition. And I think what I've taken forward with screenings of the film are conversations around how you let go of one thing and step into another. And the public exhibitions, which I've now been a creator of and also an observer and a filmmaker of, is a very special thing. But as Sunanna said earlier, it's very hard to quantify joy or excitement or a sense of achievement or things like that that are very social and emotional. So I think we have to have those conversations, and then we have to figure out what we drop in terms of metrics, and we have to figure out what we're going to embrace in terms of a sense of patience about how learning unfolds over a lifetime. And so that's my 2 cents on the first question that you asked.
That makes a lot of sense. Sunanna, do you have a perspective on the first question?
This one touches my heart. This is a question I've been asked a lot, and it actually goes back to Joe's question in the chat. I sometimes forget, having been at Teach for America for such a relatively little amount of time, that it's a very well-known organization. And most of what it's known for is putting recent college graduates who are, as Cho said, it's at the top of their class, basically, into schools across the United States, particularly low-income schools, because there is a huge economic and racial equity gap in the United States in terms of schooling. And it has been for 30 years a very data-driven organization. From the way the organization is run to myself as a teacher was put under, a lot of pressure to make sure that students were achieving along a certain trajectory based on data. I remember, and this wasn't a Teach for America principal, my principal peering through the window of my classroom to make sure that, my students were sitting like this and they were focused, and that they were, I literally spent time with my first grade students teaching them how to fill in a bubble test. And I just think about that moment all the time, because similar to Josh, I really feel like I contributed to this through my Teach for America experience. And so a lot of my career has been to undo what I learned in Teach for America and to think about data more holistically. And so you can think of the Reinvention Lab where I work now as an innovation lab that is powered by Teach for America, but a little bit separate from it, to intentionally think about how do we do differently as an organization? How do we both think about, things like data and things like how we recruit teachers differently, but also how do we think about learning differently? And what I often say to people when they ask me this question about, well, how do you know and how do you measure it, is, listen, measurement is important. It's really important to know where the gaps are in equity for equity purposes, but it can't be used for accountability. Assessment should be for learning, for making sure that every young person has the ability to understand where their own personal gaps are and be able to achieve, the competencies that they need. And in the United States, at least, it's used for gatekeeping into college, and it's used to punish schools often for how poorly they're doing. And the test scores come back so late that the teachers and the students can't do anything to learn from it. They're waiting until the end of the year to actually get the scores. And so I think for me, it's a lot about, yes, young people need to learn how to read. Yes, they need to know, basics of math. There are lots of ways to do that. And there are lots of ways to think about how to help both schools, young people, their parents, community members understand what young people know, so that everyone can learn from it in a very iterative fashion and continue to improve. But also, we've said this a lot. There are lots of things that you just can't measure. And there are also lots of different types of ways to measure. To me, storytelling is a form of measurement. Most likely to succeed is data, right? And that's something that we should always consider too, is that, you can only measure such a small slice of what young people know through any kind of test. And so what are the various ways in which we can think about assessment more holistically? One example I'll give before I pass it to Ted is, I don't know if y'all have escape rooms in
Yes.
Nagano. Okay, so you're familiar. So,
Escape room, right?
Yes,
like a game.
yes. So my husband-to-be, who I met through these education spaces, worked at something called the Design School at Stanford. And one thing that they built was a puzzle bus that is an escape room, but is a form of assessment. So young people work together and collaborate and solve puzzles that have to do with the subject areas in school. And so they're being assessed on collaboration, on problem solving, on creativity, and also, there are vocabulary words and math games and all kinds of things that actually do test if young people understand that knowledge. And so, we have to think about assessment radically differently if we're going to actually move from where we are now to where we need to go. With that, I will pass it to Ted.
Yeah, so this is the part. I'm going to apologize to the audience because this is the downer part of what I have to say. But I'm going to say it. It's important I say it, and you need to appreciate this. There is no turning back on how fast machine intelligence is racing ahead. Within 10, 20 years, there will not be a single routine job in the economy. None. Gone. And so if we push kids to continue to do the most formulaic, low-level things, and I've done practice tests everywhere in the world, these tests get at very low-level proficiencies. It's basically, can you come up with a formulaic answer quickly under time pressure without making a mistake? The tests gauge the exact things machine intelligence is perfect at doing. If that's what we push kids to do year in and year out, first, those kids are deeply unhappy. I've met a lot of deeply unhappy kids in the United States, and I met a lot of deeply unhappy kids when I was in Japan. I had kids come up to me at some of our events in tears saying, please help me get out of this school. So we think we're pushing them to do something that's going to help them. We're actually pushing them to have useless skills and a mindset that actually works to their disadvantage. We're setting those kids up, whether they score well or not, for lifetimes of unhappiness and unemployment. And any parent can pull the ripcord and not do that. Any classroom teacher can pull the ripcord and not do that. Any principal can say, that's not what we're going to do. Nobody has to wait for the Minister of Education there to say this is okay, because these are your kids. These are not the Minister of Education's kids. These are your kids. And I promise you that we just can't even begin to imagine how fast artificial intelligence and agile robotics are moving ahead. So you're either going to be on the right side of that, you're going to be inventing those things, or far more importantly, learning how to take advantage of them to be more creative and more productive. We're either going to equip kids with the skills to take advantage of that wave of innovation, or we're going to keep doing what we've always done, and we're going to set them up to be crushed by it. And I have talked to so many for parents who are listening. I've had so many conversations with parents, and they always say, all I really want is for my child to be happy. And then you observe what they're doing to that child, and they are doing the exact opposite. They are making that kid miserable by pushing them to get really good at something the kid has no interest in. When the kid asks, am I ever going to use it? The answer is probably not. And all you're saying is just do useless things to be better on paper than your classmates, so you can maybe get into a slightly better college. This is not helping kids. And so once people realize that, if in fact, Emmy, it's decades to change this, your society, just as ours, has every chance of falling apart. And we have just been through the most hellacious 4 years in the United States. And even in this last election, with somebody as president who was off the charts incompetent, ignorant, and hateful. I mean, a despicable human being, and he still got 75 million votes. Why? 75 million people have seen their ability to earn a livelihood crushed, compressed, diminished, because it's being done by automated solutions. All those people, Sunanna taught, first and second graders. You always get excited around young. When I was in Tokyo, we spent some time with really young kids, bubbling with curiosity, creative beyond belief, willing to stare down failure. They'll take a million chances to do something they want to do. That is exactly what we want our adults to be like. But what do? We crush it out them year in and year out in an attempt to make them perfect scorers. And meanwhile, we're hollowing out their souls and impairing their ability to move forward in life in a fulfilling way. The good news, and this is really good news, is I have seen schools change in months. I've seen districts change in 2 years, top to bottom. If the teachers and the parents and the students say, that's what we want, it will happen. And here's more good news. The test scores don't plummet. Everybody's saying, like, if we don't do the standardized curriculum and do test prep, our test scores will fall apart. The actual facts are, if kids can't stand being in school, they don't test that well. If kids love being in school, if they can't wait to get there, if their mind is racing, they'll do just fine. And so it really is a choice we each have to make. Parents have to make for their own kids. Classroom teachers make for the kids they're teaching in their class, principals or superintendents or wherever you are in the education chain. We all have to make that choice. And to me, it's clear, and I think we owe it to our kids to at least think very carefully about it, understand the consequences of what we do when we say, oh, 97% on that test, why didn't you get a 99%? Why didn't you get, drill more, drill more, drill more? Because when you give that kid that message year in and year out, it sinks in. I mean, that shapes who they're going to be. And then you get these risk-averse adults who can't manage their own efforts, who always want to know in the workplace what they have to do to get an A, who are constantly looking for approval, who have lost the joy in their life and their ethical compass. And honestly, when you look going forward, the message I would give to Japan is, if you're not an incredibly innovative country, you're not going to hold your economic power. I give the same message in the United States. And one thing that we collectively should be frightened about is the country that's seen most likely to succeed the most views of any country in the world and most likely to succeed is China. And China is not fooling around on this. They realize, my gosh, we need our schools to produce joyful, purposeful, creative adults. And they're not now, just as we're not. And I think you're not, but they're serious about it. And when China gets serious about it, sometimes things happen. And so we don't have the luxury of time. This is urgent, and this is a fight worth fighting. But I do believe it's very rewarding to take it on. And I think we can do incredible things in a much shorter period of time than people generally anticipate.
It's so true that, like, the whole rise of machine intelligence is one of the big reasons why I became involved in education as well. And I think we've, for so many years, treated kids as if they were a machine, although they're human, with interest and, strengths and weaknesses of individuals. So I think I think a lot of educators here in this conversation know about it, and they're making an effort to strive forward. And one of the biggest challenges, especially in public education, is that there may be one or two teachers in each school who've already realized this, and they want to take things forward. But for first, it's a capacity building reasons. There's not enough sort of like resources or training materials or peers to talk to about how they want to move forward. And they get kind of grinded down to the traditional ways, and sort of like, so there's a group of people who want to make things happen, but oftentimes they get sort of shut down because of sort of the cultural pressure, I guess. And I know you have started whatschoolcouldbe.org with innovation playlists as resources for every teacher or every educator to take on. And can you talk a little bit about that and how that can be an individual resource, but also a resource to maybe help these teachers or the educators to connect across and be empowered?
Yeah. Well, when I initially started traveling with Most Likely to Succeed, people would see it, and honestly, parents would say, that's the kind of school I want my kid in. Kids would say, I want to be in that school. Teachers, everybody's saying, boy, that is what we'd really love to have. And then people would say, but we could never do that. That's so far beyond what we could do. We could just never do that. And I would say, you can. But I think they were really saying to me, is there anything you can do to help with that? And I'm not sure I would have come up with it on my own. But the second thing I saw, which was so interesting, is as I'd visit schools who had gotten the DVD back then, I'd walk around the school and there'd be clusters of teachers watching segments of the film. They'd be watching exhibition night and they'd say, oh, kids can publicly exhibit learning. They'd be watching kids debating each other. They'd be watching kids, clustered around a table trying to get a project done. And they'd say, how can we do some of that in our school? Which then led to this resource we've got, which is whatschoolcouldbe.org. So it's easy to, I hope it's easy to remember, where we provide pathways to the things you see in that film that you admire. How can you go from an entirely teacher-driven instruction model to more student-driven learning? So we have these small little building blocks that you can try. And we always say, don't make every teacher do it in a school, but have a few try it. And as you said, every school has some that are really leaning in and would love to do more innovative things. So to me, the kiss of death for change is if somebody comes along and says, everyone has to. Because once you say everyone has to, you take the choice out of it. You take the meaning out of it. And you unleash a lot of grumpsters who are just going to try to take the process down. They're going to complain. They're going to say, I don't want to be told what to do. Instead, you say, who'd like to? Give kids time to come up with thought-provoking questions. Let kids debate each other. Let kids actually spend time saying, this is what I want to learn. Let them spend a class period or a day or 3 days going deep on it. Just a series of things suggested in a coherent sequence that take you from old school to the type of school you'd love to have. But we start and we feature some of the great work that Sunanna did in Pittsburgh, which I really want to, she's very modest, but what they did was so, so important because they generated not bits and dabs of drips and drab, I've got my wrong words, but anyway, they're not little tiny points of excitement about it. They got this whole great big community, a community the size of Nagano, bigger, I guess, roughly, several million people all saying, this is great. And suddenly that obsession with test scores starts to fade when people start to say, no, this is better. We love this. And we can actually see it and we can observe it and we can evaluate it. And we see these middle school kids doing, water quality monitoring systems. And you say, oh my gosh, I never imagined they could do that. And some of you say, do I really care about their test scores? No, they're doing something that they are learning enormously with. They're getting good at creating things, sticking with it till they accomplish something they're proud of, and solving a meaningful problem in their community. And to build on what Josh said, all the better when you pull in local nonprofits and businesses, adults who are mentors, organizations that need help from kids that are willing to lean in. And then you get this entire community enthusiasm about a whole different vision. And the beauty is, Nagano, if you do this, you're going to sprint ahead of every other prefecture in Japan. They will be looking at you and saying, oh my gosh, how'd they do it? How did they do it? And they did it because they just stepped back and said, no, we can do it. We can do so many better things. And we're not going to be tied to the anchor of history. We're not going to have a school that is just like the school I went to 50 years ago. We're going to have a school our kids need for their future. And when we do it, people get energized and there is no turning back. In Pittsburgh, there is no turning back. In Hawaii, there is no turning back. These communities have said, no, this is better. And I just think that is something that inspires communities, something that communities get excited about and take pride in. And when those kids come home from school and the parent says, how'd you like school today? I loved it. It was so great. I got to actually work on something I cared about. It's like, whoa, what's wrong with that?
Yeah, definitely.
Emmy, I would jump in and just note that in the chat, Akiko wrote something about showing the film to students. So to piggyback on what Ted said, it's one thing for educators and education leaders, administrators to watch the film and to generate conversations. It's another thing to include parents and possibly community members, businesses, nonprofits in that discussion. It's a whole nother thing when you show the film to your students. And I've done that a couple of times here in Hawaii, and Ted's aware of Molokai High School on the island of Molokai here, where a very courageous principal showed not only Most Likely to Succeed, but another film called What is School For with E.A. Prince, and generated, it was a bold and brave move because what she was doing was kind of handing off the ownership of the conversation to her students. So my thought is, start screening the film to students and see what they say. And if they say, why can't I get this kind of education? I think you have to take that question seriously, really seriously. I think that one's coming from the heart for them.
In terms of like letting go, I think that's one of the biggest challenges for adults, because we have experienced the traditional education and that reflection, natural reflexes to sort of like, oh, I know this looks great, but that's not what I know. Especially for parents, I'm a parent myself as well, and it's taken me a long time to sort of like transforming myself from knowing to believing and taking an action. And I'm just curious, Sunanna, what have you seen in the community work that you have done in Pittsburgh in terms of like pivotal experiences that people have kind of gone through to slowly or rapidly transforming the mindset?
You know, I'm going to do a radical thing right now, which is disagree with Ted on something that he said. Ted, I'm sorry. You know, we're friends. I can do that. We can disagree sometimes.
Totally.
He said once you do it, you can't go back. And I've seen many schools go back, actually, because that pull back to traditional systems is strong, because it is not just in practice, it's in your heart. You know, you grow up with a system, and there are a lot of people who want that system for nostalgic and cultural reasons, in addition to everything else. I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot is that, for me, a core tenet of reinvention is a dramatic shift in power in the school building and in the classroom. Young people are the most impacted by school and have the least institutional power to do anything in a school building. And to me, what that means is young people, even kindergarten, first grade young people, having deep agency over what they're learning, have power in their learning, and have the ability to have institutional power to hire and fire teachers, right? To set budgets, to do things that are institutional. And that butts up against a cultural norm in many places, which is respect for elders. And that's huge, you know, to put a young person on an equal playing field and say, you have different expertise than me, but nonetheless expertise, and you should be able to own that, is a very difficult thing culturally in a lot of places. And so I've seen places where there are one or two teachers at a school, and that school is on fire for a little while. Those teachers leave and it retreats. I was just talking to a young person the other day who was at a very innovative school in Alabama. And over the course of time, you know, community members, as more community members started to move into that school, it has totally reverted and reversed back to a very traditional school model. And so the question for me is, to answer your question, Emmy, is how do you, the word that I always come back to is co-create. Like, how is it actually that it's not just one or two teachers, or if it starts that way, those one or two teachers have the visibility and the other teachers have the space to move, to be able to actually make larger and larger change and to pull people naturally in. A part of that is joy. Like, if I see Ted in his classroom and he is just having a blast, I'm like, well, I want to have a blast when I come to work. So part of that is just pulling people in naturally, because people move towards joy. But part of it is also saying, when I often use this image, and this is what I'll close on in terms of how to get larger scale change from one or two teachers that start with it, is the image, which I got from Adrienne Marie Brown's work, Emergent Strategy, is picture a flock of birds. And in that flock of birds, there's usually one or two that has the ability to change the entire flock. And it's a different one or two sometimes, it moves around. But there are two things that are required for that flock to move. The first is that the initial bird like sees a threat or an opportunity, in this case, like, you know, what Ted was talking about, the changing economy, and actually like has space to move to be able to do that. So they have autonomy and creativity to be able to do something differently, which in a lot of places is not the case. And also every other bird has space to move in front and behind them. So when this bird moves, everyone else can move, right? They have actually the space so they're not bumping into each other. And at every level, you know, from principal all the way down to teacher, all the way down to student, has agency and ability to move. but also that bird has to have visibility. Like everyone else in the flock needs to be able to see that bird. And I think in schools, often you go into your classroom and close the door, and these one or two teachers who are doing amazing things are doing it in total isolation in their rooms, cut off from the rest of the school. And so of course, when those two teachers leave, you know, everything that they brought with them is now out the window. And so how do you to turn an entire flock and actually turn it pretty quickly? I think space to move for all involved, and also like deep visibility into what folks are doing is so critically important, so that everyone can feel and experience the emotional response and the logic of what this change is creating.
That makes a lot of sense to help me understand why Remake Learning Days and the activities that you're doing and making even Playbook like public. It makes a lot of sense that you're kind of sharing what's going on in different flocks and oh, Sunanna, you are muted.
Oh, I was just saying, absolutely. And I think when Ted came to Pittsburgh, we have these big yellow bridges in Pittsburgh. And, you know, he was driving across a bridge and there was a huge sign that said Remake Learning Days on the bridge. I mean, it was truly, you know, it wasn't just in schools. It was like the entire community was thinking about and seeing, right, remake learning. Like how do we think differently about this? And so the visibility piece is huge, but it's not just huge in a community, it's huge in a school. And it's huge for parents and community members and teachers and principals and superintendents and young people to have like experiential learning of this happen in order for it to really take hold.
That makes
And
a lot
of sense.
Yes.
I would add to what Sunanna said and what Ted said, that yes, I've also seen spectacular examples of where a mountain was climbed and then there was a steep descent back into traditional ways of doing things. I've seen that happen many times. On the other hand, as in any culture, in any society, witness what's happened here in the United States over the last 4 years, you have to keep reminding yourself of who you are and what your highest ideals are. And one of the things that I decided to do when Ted first came to Hawaii in May of 2016, you know, it was actually kind of a strange moment. I swim laps every day in a pool or out in the ocean. And I was in the middle of a lap when it occurred to me that Ted was coming to Hawaii for the first time. So I needed to find a documentary filmmaker to help me make a film about a documentary filmmaker coming to Hawaii. And I ended up doing that, right? It's a 30-minute documentary film in which I essentially filmed Ted's entire 6-day visit. And my point is that I've done that over and over and over again with a podcast, with social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. And what I'm doing is trying to help the community keep reminding itself over and over and over again what its highest ideals are. And I really do believe that ultimately the community will come to student-driven learning as its highest ideal, because they just witness the joy that comes with that when students are in charge of their learning. But we have to just keep putting it up there over and over and over again. And I think whatschoolcouldbe.org is actually positioned to do that in a really spectacular way. And I'm really excited about that. And I think Nagano would want to think about how to do that. Tell the stories, put them up there, and keep reminding yourselves where your North Star is and what direction you're headed.
It's true that, I mean, your podcast is amazing. You know, Remake Learning Day is amazing. The Reinvention Lab, I read the report and that was amazing. You know, Ted's film and books are amazing. I mean, I think they all have contagious energy to make you want to be, or us want to be part of it. And I think in Nagano, we would like to see something along that line of visibility and sort of contagious energy. And on that note, I would love to invite some local. Yes.
Because one of in the chat, Yoshi Yagasaki made an excellent point, and I have to say, it does break my heart when schools go back to the old way. I feel like, darn, all this work to get you to think differently. But his point, and I think this is, you know, there's a reason they call it an education system, and there are all these interlocking parts. And so his point was, I'll read it. It may be difficult to change things without changing the high school and university entrance exam systems in Japan. And that absolutely happens here, where you start to do more inventive, creative things. And then some of the parents get worried that this isn't going to be as strong a college application as it could be. And we need to get rid of that and start taking more advanced placement courses or whatever. And so I think I do have some optimism here, because I think, at least in our country, the degree of conviction that college is the only path forward, and that everything hinges on which college you get into, I think that's starting to change. And I think colleges, I've been working hard with the college admissions people to get them to, if we could change college admissions in our country, we would change K through 12 overnight. If colleges said we're going to accept kids based on examples of great work instead of numbers. But many colleges here are dropping the SAT and the ACT. And I think they're beginning to realize they're losing a lot of great kids and ruining a lot of kids' childhoods with their criteria. But I think that is sort of the elephant in the room in terms of what often panics people about doing something bolder and more creative. But I also would say, back to my experience with the world of innovation, is that more and more of the careers going forward will be careers that young adults create instead of jobs they apply for. And as the number of jobs that are there to apply for drop, if they can't create their own career path, they're going to be in a world of hurt. And so if you spend time in your K through 12, K through 16 years creating things, creating paths for yourself, you're that much better prepared. And honestly, when you enter the creative economy, nobody cares that much about your credentials. They just want to know what you can do. So I think it's some long-term trends could help us here, but
that's true. People I work with, I don't really ask which school they went to, or I work with them because they're interested in it, or they have, they have talent that they can offer to the table. So it is true that the work we create doesn't have much to do with which school we went to. Yeah.
Emmy, if I can chime in here for just a quick second.
Yes.
So to Ted's point, there's a school on Hawaii Island, otherwise known as the Big Island here in Hawaii. It's called Hawaii Preparatory Academy. It is a private school. It's a boarding school. Many times we think about capstone programs as being a senior course. It's the last thing you do before you leave high school. Because of one visionary school leader who's a teacher and the capstone coordinator, they're now implementing capstone programs at the 5th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade level. So what that means is that hundreds of kids, by the time they graduate, will have had multiple opportunities to execute a program, either individually or in groups, that have a huge impact on the community, because that's the criteria. You can't just do it for yourself. It has to be a community-facing project. So whether it's studying green sea turtles or Pacific voyaging or developing websites, whatever it is. And so I think in things like that, there's a greater possibility that they won't slip back to where they were before, because the critical mass of kids who are really excited about this, they're going to influence the culture of the school and who the school admits as students. They're going to have a big influence on that. And that's to Cho's comment in the chat there, just about trying to words of encouragement for not slipping back. And especially during COVID, I would direct everybody to whatschoolcouldbe.org and listen to the Ted's video there called Why Not Now. It's about 6 or 7 minutes long. It is that encouragement for how we step forward during COVID,
right,
and be creative in what we do.
Yeah, I also listened to a podcast on HPA's coordinators interview, and he was talking about students creating HPA's website and videos, and that is quite an agency that they are exhibiting. And
and it can happen in public schools.
Thank you for all the great insights. And I would like to take this moment to invite 3 local guests here. Mr. Tagawa, Mr. Karaki, and Ms. Minagawa, can you show your video? ビデオを出して参加していただいてよろしいですか？ thank you for your patience. And now I think we're just waiting for Mr. Tagawa. But let's start with you, Minagawa-san. Can you? We've had sort of a lot of topics covered today, but just curious, like, can you introduce yourself briefly and maybe share what you're working on and what you'd like to ask the panelists today?
はい、こんにちは。私は皆川瑞穂と申しまして、長野県の池田町という小さな町で、保護者に向けて、新しい学びの場ってどんなのだろうっていうのを、知るための、ある意味啓発活動のようなものを展開しています。毎月1回の学びの会の他には、Most Likely to Succeedの上映会は、2019年には5回上映して、だいたい250人ぐらいの町内外の方がご覧くださっています。で、池田町の上映を皮切りに、県内でも5カ所ぐらい上映の場が増えていったということを聞いています。はい、で私たちはもともとは野外保育っていう認可保育施設に子どもを通わせていた保護者なので、自由な遊びの場を大切にするっていうことを子どもを通して知った立場なんですけれども、一般的な公立学校とのつながりが難しいっていうことをただ聞いていたので、その一番の理由っていうのが学校の管理教育が今まで自由に子どものクリエイティビティを生かしながら、過ごしていたその部分がと相反するっていうところで、なおかつ宿題は家に帰ってきたその余暇の時間まで管理されるっていうことで、ちょっとその部分を学校と、どういうふうにして子どもにとって一番安心安全な場所になるだろうかっていう協議をしていこうと考えていたところ、Most Likely to Succeedに出会って、じゃあ、私たちが直接学校に掛け合うのではなく、いろんな人とこの事実を共有して、いろんなボトムアップにつなげられたらなっていうような活動にシフトを、していったっていうきっかけになった、映画でした。で、ハイテクハイに研修に行かれた先生たちを交えたシンポジウムなんかもやって、そうですね。で、町長選挙があったんですけども、その際には教育について、どこまで、新しく候補になる方たちが考えてくださるかっていうのを知るための、討論会を開催したり、それはもう町で市民が開催するっていうのはそれこそ初めてだったらしいんですけども、それをさらに教育に特化して話してもらうっていうような機会を、作ったり、あと請願活動をしたり、政治的に取り組むっていうことも積極的に望んできています。で、今回このトークを聞かせていただいて、もうなんかすごいシャワーのようにたくさんの情報が入ってきて、今何か質問ありますかって言われて、ってなってしまうんですけれども、私がちょっとびっくりしたのは、私たちこの活動を3年でやめるって思っているんです。で、なぜかっていうと、私たちは今のところただの、主婦をしながら子育てをしつつボランティアでこの活動をしていて、この活動にかかることに収入というのは一切ない状況で、主婦ですので働いてちょっとちっちゃいパートはしてたりするんですけれども、
ホストにビデオを停止してビデオ開始できませんって。
大丈夫ですか？
大丈夫です。
はい。そういった絡みでちょっと4人共同代表全員が、ずっと継続していて、長いことこの活動していくのが難しいと思っていたんですが、今日お話を聞いていて、皆さんもボランティアで取り組んでらして、いろんな大きな変革につなげてらっしゃるっていうことをすごく、ある驚きを持って、受け止めました。で、いろんな場所で、子どもがやっぱり子ども自身がこの問題を、どう捉えるかっていうことが大切だなっていうようなお話も出てきて、池田町では教育大綱というものが去年できまして、子どもが真ん中っていうキーワードを掲げてるんですけれども、そういったその子どもが真ん中っていう視点で取り組むことが大切、やっぱり一番後戻りにつながりにくい結果を生むのではないかという感想を持ちました。で、質問として話す相手もいろいろ選んでいくべきだっていうようなこともトークの中にあったと思うんですけども、池田町 は特に保守的だっていうようなことをいろんな方がおっしゃるんですね。町内の方でさえそういうふうにおっしゃる方がいるんですけれども、このイノベーティブなことに対してとても保守的な方に対してこれから社会変革がこうやって起こっていくんだよっていうこと以外に何かオプショナルな伝えるメッセージってお持ちでいらっしゃいますか？皆さん何か自分と確実に目線が違う方に対してどういうふうに向き合っているのかなっていうところをちょっと参考に知りたいなって思いました。これが質問です。
Can one of you take her questions? Since we have two more guests coming in, I think we would like to limit to one person responding. Ted, would you like to? You're muted. I think, Ted, you're still muted.
My screen disappeared on me.
You're back.
Where'd you go? I'll try to be brief because we want to get to some other great observations. But one of on this whatschoolcouldbe.org website, which we're rolling out in the next month or so with the mobile app and the ability for communities of educators to form and talk to each other, because I think Sunanna's point, if you can get collaboration among the teaching force, that makes a lot of difference. But we have a whole set of resources. We call it Mobilize Your Community. And I think when you're trying to change a school, the worst thing you can do is be on your own. We always say start by getting allies. And we've got not just most likely to succeed, but we've got several great films we've produced, or some we just, I worked for 2.5 years with Sir Ken Robinson before he passed away last summer. So we say, show his TED Talk. We've got one on the future of work. We've got a bunch of things. But I think building a broader set of people and then having that roll into not everything has to change overnight, but who wants to start taking small steps, that often will get you in a point where you're starting to make progress, even if you have people in the system that are really resistant to change. So it's build a coalition of like-minded people so that there's some show of force that this is important, and then say, no, we're not saying we want to change everything overnight, but can we start doing a few things and see how it goes?
Thanks, Ted, and thanks, Mizuho-san. And I would like to now move on to the next guest, Mr. Tagawa. Can you unmute your microphone, please? マイクをミュート。はい、田川先生、こんにちは。
はい、こんにちは。奈良市の中心市街地にある鍋畑小学校で校長をしています田川雅彦と言います。よろしくお願いします。文化と言われる時代に生きる子どもたちに、自ら問いを立てて学ぶ力、地域社会の一員として課題に向き合う力をつけたいということで、子どもたちが主人公の学校づくり、自立した学習者の育成を目標に、多様性を包摂する学校づくり、学びの個別最適化を目指す授業改革に取り組んでいます。コロナはそのスピードを加速したように思います。今年は4年生が大型百貨店の閉店とコロナによって低迷した地域経済の活性化を目指して活動する年間を通じた総合的な学習に取り組んできました。また昨年の6年生は米作りから始まっておにぎりの商品化販売まで農業の6次産業化に取り組みました。学校としても大学や高校、公民館とのコラボによって新しい学びの創造をしたり、地域と共同した防災訓練やキャリア教育、あるいは学校農園の市民への開放など積極的に学びを地域に開いてまいりました。こうしたプロジェクト型の学びから子どもたちは非常にソフトスキルを向上させているように感じています。この夏休みにはこのMost Likely to Succeedを全職員で見て未来の学校について対話もさせていただきました。今年コロナでなかなかうまく学校行事ができなかったわけですが、運動会や音楽会を子どもたちに企画立案をさせて実行をしたということもやってまいりました。今日のお話は非常に刺激的でよく私の感覚としては理解できるお話でした。成果 を求めるところと、その評価の在り方というところは非常に我々も悩ましいところではあるんですけれども、現状のそういう学校制度の中で自己変革を続ける教員をどのように育てていったらいいかっていうことが一番私たちのテーマだというふうに感じました。ありがとうございました。
高橋先生、ありがとうございました。So, so we definitely have pockets of innovations in Nagano, and I think what Mr. Tagawa is explaining is kind of opening up a school to invite more communities to come in. And I'm just curious, Josh, do you have any comment on like maybe Hawaii's example of how maybe Mr. Tagawa's effort can even further?
Yes, I do. I think what has the most potential for success is, as a school leader, to identify what we might call your high flyers. You have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 educators on your campus who are predisposed towards redesigning what they're doing, or they are lifelong learners as educators. If you find them, you want to support them, you want to resource them, but even more important than that, you want to help them to become coaches of other educators. Coaching is not an innate thing. It's actually something that can be learned. And great coaches in athletics, hopefully Japan will get to host the Olympics at some point here post-COVID. Coaches are very special people, but people who become coaches because of great coaches are also very special. And I think that's the process as you move forward, is to identify your high flyers and then coach them up, and then teach and have them develop coaching in other people. It's the capacity building process. But as Sunanna mentioned in the chat there, you have to bring your students along the way. You have to invite them into the design process and into the coaching process. Then you have a really high probability of success.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Tagawa Sensei. And now we only have 2 minutes, and sorry, Karaki-san, for your patience. And can you unmute now and start your introduction and question? Thank you.
伊那市役所に勤めております唐木理恵と申します。事務職員です。特に教育に大きく関わった経験があるわけではありません。伊那市は人口7万人をちょっとかけるぐらいです。人口減少っていう、一般的な社会現象の中で、持続可能な社会っていうのはどういう、地域っていうのはどうあったらいいかなっていう中で、人がつながっていくとか、人をつないでいくとか、そういうことに関心を持ってずっとおりました。そのためには大人でありますけれども、どんな成長の場があって、どんな学びの場があればいいのかなっていうのをすごく関心を持ってこれまで、いたところです。今移動しましたが、これまで、少し前に携わっていたところでキャリア教育のお手伝いという仕事がありました。高校の探究の学びのお手伝いをしたりとか、その流れで、県立高校の在り方についての地域の意見をまとめる会議の事務局を務めておりました。その中で自分の持っていた課題といろいろ教育っていうところに関わったときに、いわゆる受け身ではなく、自ら学んで自ら考える、自ら行動できる人が育ってくることがこの地域のためにすごく大切だなと。ついてはそれが一人一人の幸せに暮らすためにつながるなということを感じてまいりました。で、そういうものを可視化して地域の皆さんにお示しできるもの、何か映像がないかなと思っていたときに出会ったのがモーストライクリートゥサクシードです。すごく私にとっては衝撃的な映画で、これだと思ったことを今でも思い出します。上映会と上映会の後の対話の時間というような会を約10回以上設けて、その中でやはり私が少しもともと課題に感じていた人と人がつながっていく瞬間、対話の場を設けたことで つながっていく瞬間がいくつもできて、なんとなく自分の思っていたことをやっていることを納得したなっていう、そんなことを感じています。課題としましては、やはり今お話にもありましたけれども、っていうのはやっぱり経験の範囲内でしか何か判断をできないというか、そこから一歩踏み出して考えるっていう、何か一つを壊して考えるっていうのがすごく、難しいなと思っていて、前に進まないもどかしさみたいな、分かってもらえているのがよくわからないもどかしさみたいなところが、感じておりますが、それは、今お話にもありましたピッツバーグでも後戻りする現実だとか、過去を懐かしむというような風潮みたいな、そういうようなところもすごく生の声聞けて、少し私の中でも安心ということでもないですね、安心をしたというところがあります。印象に残ったのは、何か一つを手放してっていうようなお話がございました。これまでの皆が思っている価値観だけではなくて、何か一つ手放す勇気みたいなものも必要かなと思いましたし、お話の中ではやり続けることの勇気みたいなものも今日いただけたなというふうに思いました。私自身はそういう意味では、何か大きく変わっていく期待みたいなものも感じたんですけれども、それと同時にやっぱり一人一人が何か一人一人のレベルで変化していくっていうプロセスを自分でちょっとなくしちゃいけないなっていうふうに感じたところです。日本の言葉で良きことはカタツムリのように進むっていう言葉もありますので、ちょっと感想になってしまいますけれども、感想と本当に感謝の言葉になりますけれども、それを改めて確認した、この時間になりました。ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございます。Sunanna, do you have a reaction to his comment? Oh, okay.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
I was just curious, do you have a reaction to his comment? Because I think some of what he shared is related to your perspectives. And
I just, I was smiling as he was speaking. One, I love that saying, what was it that he said? Good things are as slow as a snail. What was that? What was it?
Yeah, because snail walks very, very slowly.
Yes. I love that. People often say to me, this should be faster and use slow like it's a dirty word, or a bad word. And I just think sometimes things do have to happen slowly, and that we get farther if we go slower together, rather than rushing through and kind of pushing things through at a speed that not everyone is together on. And so I think that, hitting it on the head with the courage to keep going, even in the face of, yes, sometimes things not working out, or in the face of seeing schools slide back, because while there were schools where that happened, the vast majority of places in Pittsburgh are doing incredible work and are continuing to move forward. And so just as we think about, young people being able to learn from failure and not, taking it as something that's going to live with them the rest of their life, but as an opportunity to learn, we have to do that too, as educators, as communities, as people who are doing this work, and understand that not everything is going to be perfect, but that slowly and steadily, working together, we can work towards something different. So I appreciated learning that saying too. I'll be using that in the future. So appreciate it.
Thanks, Nada, and thanks, Karaki-san.
Emmy, I would
Yes.
just add, I'm so impressed by that growth mindset. In an educator, to meet an educator, as I just did on screen, somebody who's clearly going to be growing and developing and changing over the course of a lifetime, that's just beyond inspiring. That's what we want from our kids, of course. So, we modeled that. So bravo to that.
Thank you, Josh. I'd like to, if you guys are okay extending 5 more minutes, address the few questions coming online. So thank you for the guests, Taga-sensei, Minaga-san, and Karaki-san. And I would like to move on to Q&As from the audience. First question is around social and emotional intelligence. I know there's been a big focus on SEL, or social emotional learning, in the US for the past decades, 20 or 30 years. But he would like to know, what is the current situation? It's a big question, so I know it's hard to answer generally, but maybe in the context of this sort of engaged learning or project-based learning and the social emotional learning aspect, if you can maybe comment one example of how that is being embedded to help kids learn more authentically or more engaged way. Josh or Sunanna,
Yeah, sure. I can just say very quickly that one of the things that I've observed over the last 6 years here in Hawaii, public, private, and charter, is that people are coming to a wonderful place, which is that social and emotional learning is not a separate class that you take. It is a cultural shift that happens in any subject, whether it's a single subject or interdisciplinary work or project work. It is something that's part of the culture of that learning. It is not a standalone thing. You can't have a separate class to learn how to be kind, compassionate, and patient. You have to work with other human beings in order to develop those skills and habits and dispositions. So I'm really encouraged by this. And I think, if that's what's happening in Nagano, that's a good thing. That's a really good thing.
Great. And just thank you. And one last question. This is a tricky question, but I'm going to try to read this. When Board of Education of Nagano tried to change the education from just getting knowledge to something deeper, they introduced new standard where students' motivation and other emotional states of mind are judged. I find it somewhat scary. Do you have any opinion on this? I think what she's trying to mention is that, okay, now we recognize that non-cognitive skills is important, but we want to measure. So let's create a new standard and try to measure it. And I guess, I don't know if that's really happening, but if that happens, that's a little scary trend, is what this person's mentioned. And I think early part of the conversation, Sunanna, and you were talking about, you can't measure everything. And but I guess the Board of Education Nagano may feel more obligation to measure if it's important. And I guess it's a pretty common dilemma. But Ted, do you have any comment on this question now that you've seen all the great practices around the US and world? And
I not on that, without seeing exactly what they're proposing, it's hard to really comment. I'd say in general, the things that matter going forward for our kids are the things that can't be boiled down to a number. Back to some of the comments I made. As parents, we all want our kids to be good kids. I mean, like, tell me the standardized test for being a good person. It's like, I think that we let these numbers chase all the real learning out of our schools. And so, so I feel like it's one of the things, and it sort of gets at the question before as well, is when kids work together in teams on complicated projects, kids get different ways to show their strengths, different talents they can develop, different things they can feel proud of. That goes along. That doesn't solve every SEL problem, but that addresses a lot of them. And I think the other thing, and we didn't make the biggest of deals out of it, maybe should have emphasized it more with High Tech High. A lot of those kids go there because they have real learning challenges, but it's a school that values kids for what they create, whereas most of education tests kids on the narrow means that some kids use to learn. And so I think that whole thing, it's really, to contrast it with, we have an education system that's largely paint by, like connect the dots paintings. And, like if your lines are straight and you can do a bunch of those things in a hurry, you're viewed as a great student. And we need schools that let kids be artistic, because that's what the world's going to care about going forward. And I think when kids are artistic, as I say, social and emotional issues are complex. There are a lot of things I don't profess to have any expertise on. but you make a lot of progress in terms of making each kid feel confident, valued, and supported by those around them when they're in an environment that cares about those things.
Thank you, Ted. Sunanna, did you want to?
I'll just say this question hit me really hard. I think one thing to note is young people are going through an immense amount of trauma right now across the world. You know, virtual learning is not, human beings are social beings. They like to be with each other, particularly if they're 13 years old, like my niece right now, who's been in virtual learning for a year and hasn't been able to see any of her friends. You know, if there was ever a time to focus on social emotional learning, it's right now. It's always been critical, but it's so critical now because we've got a whole generation of kids who have been traumatized by this pandemic and traumatized by isolation. And, you know, one thing that we've done at the lab to try and think about how to do differently as an adult-led organization is actually work alongside young people. So we have a group of young people that is working with us, you know, really consistently. In fact, I met today. And they've changed my whole mind about social emotional learning because they say in a lot of our schools, there are posters on the wall and there are standards that say this is really important. And some of their schools even measure it. And they said, I can tell the difference between that and a teacher just loving me and caring about who I am as a person and building a relationship with me. That is social emotional learning. The shirt that Josh is wearing is from a school where young people lead Dreamhouse Eva Beach, where young people are leading their own social emotional learning, designing the curriculum and leading the social emotional learning, and there's no adult in the room. It's just space for young people to process on their own. And, you know, and then there's some spaces with adults too, but it's never been more important than right now.
That is so true. Thank you so much for your time. And I would like to end with just one very short comment from each panelist. Can we start from you, Josh, and Sunanna and Ted in the end, and then we close it?
Wow, that's some pressure, a closing comment. Emmy, I think I already wrote it in the chat. To everyone in Nagano, I'm going to echo the words of our public school superintendent, Dr. Christina Kishimoto, here in Honolulu, who has told us as a community many times, be bold, be brave, enroll the kids, and, you know, just keep going forward. You can do this. That's my closing message.
Thank you, Josh. Sunanna.
Thank you, and you're not alone. Continue to be courageous. You've got community in Nagano. You've got community across the world. We are now part of your community, and keep on doing what you know is right.
Thank you. Ted?
I'll say first, Emmy, you said you were going to be nervous about this. You've been superb. So thank you for organizing everything. This has been just great. I mean, a really wonderful forum. I've learned a lot from everybody else. So it's been exceptional. But I love the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. You know, and I'd say one other thing, it takes a village to change a school. But there's real power in coming together and working collaboratively on a goal you believe is just the most important thing you can do with your life. And so I'm really deeply grateful that everybody on a Sunday morning spent this much time on this, you know, very important topic, but this is a fight worth fighting. And it's something that brings with it a lot of joy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the guests, Tagawa-san, Minagawa-san, Karaki-san, for sharing your comments and with the community.